Hi and welcome. My name is Tracy Lenz and I'll be giving you an overview of the oil and gas industry as it is today in the U.S. I'm a petroleum engineer. I've had about 16 years in the industry and I'm the owner of Pecan Tree Oil and Gas, who is a firm that specializes in helping mineral owners understand what they own and get appraisals at affordable costs. So starting off, we have our conventional oil and gas, which just means that gravity works. So there's water underground and the oil floats on top of that, and then gas is even lighter. So the gas is on top of that. Now, these unconventional reservoirs don't really follow gravity anymore because the pores are so small. If you spilled red wine on your countertop and it's soaked into that countertop makes a better reservoir than these reservoirs. The oil and gas doesn't move through the pores. We're talking about pores so small that one molecule of water won't fit through it in some cases. So gas is a much smaller molecule than water, so gas will still fit through, but water won't. These type of reservoirs have to be completed a completely different way than how we would drain the oil from these conventional reservoirs. Conventional reservoirs are more like a bunch of marbles in a bathtub. If you drain the bathtub, all of the water will leave the bathtub, despite the fact that there's marbles in there. Unconventional reservoirs are much more like if you were to put a giant sponge in a bathtub and then drain the bathtub. You're still going to have a lot of water in that sponge. And so we had to try something different than what we've done before. So y'all have probably heard fracking, hydraulic fracturing to be more precise. What that is going down, drilling into the rock, and then just blasting it into pieces. So I've used before the analogy that these little pores are like eggs, and we have to crack each individual egg to let the egg yolk out. So to do that, we pump all this water down to create so much pressure that it just explodes the rock into little tiny pieces and creates a fracture. Hydraulic, water, fracture, crack. Hydraulically fracturing the rock and opening up all these pores. By opening up all these pores, you're kind of like cutting up the sponge into a whole bunch of pieces to where the water has to come out. Gravity has nothing to do with it. For the most part, it's all about pressure, higher pressure going to lower pressure. Now, that technology is recent. That's something that the industry figured out they could use over the last 10 to 12 years. We've seen a shift in the amount of oil we have available because we suddenly know how to get it out of these giant sponge reservoirs underground. And so by being able to free it from that rock, that opens up a ton of oil and gas that we weren't able to get before. And that's the shift that we've seen the last 10 or 12 years. So now we're looking at a slide that shows all the wells in the United States. That is how many wells that have been drilled over the last 100 plus years. But we're not really interested in all the wells because it's shifted so much. So let's look at just what's been developed over the last 3 years. So these are the wells that have been drilled over the last 3 years, from 2019 to 2022. This is what I'm considering mid-continent. So in the mid-continent, this is where all the action's been happening the last 3 years. So the EIA has a map that shows the basins and shale plays. If you ever want to get a feel for what's going on a high level, EIA has a lot of information available that you can go and look. They have tons of maps. They have tons of charts. They have a weekly outlook that gives an overview of what's happening. It's a little dry, but you can read it. I like this in general, but I like my maps better, so we're going to put it on my map. This map is all the basins with the last 3 years of activity overlaid on top of it. And now we can see which basins are really the most active. So we have the Western Gulf of Mexico, the Permian Basin, the Anadarko Basin, the Williston Basin, which is the Bakken play that you've probably heard about, Powder River, the Denver Basin, which is also the DJ Basin. Those are really the main activity points today. There's also Appalachia, which is the Marcellus Shale over in the Pennsylvania side of things. And then there's the San Joaquin Basin and stuff in California, different animals. Okay, so now we're going to look at where all the value is happening. This heat map really shows you what areas have the most bang for your buck on a dollar per acre basis. So now if I filter those last 3 years of wells into just those horizontal wells, just the ones that are targeting tight or shale oil and gas, these are the areas that stand out. And this is going to be important in a minute, because these areas are the ones that's producing the most amount of oil and gas that's new. Once again, the same areas that had value. So we have Permian, Eagle Ford, Bakken, DJ Basin, Powder River, Anadarko, Haynesville. Now you've probably heard of the Keystone Pipeline. At this point, who hasn't, right? So the Keystone Pipeline and the Keystone XL are two different pipelines. That gets confused a lot. I did myself in the beginning. But Keystone Pipeline, two different pipelines. Keystone is an existing pipeline, and the Keystone XL is on this map, this yellow line that connects Canada down to the Keystone. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is actually nowhere near where U.S. oil and gas is being produced. The whole point of the Keystone Pipeline is to get oil from Canada into the U.S. and into our market, not necessarily to get more U.S. oil and gas online. Because if you look, where would it be coming from? It's not anywhere near the places where a lot of oil and gas is coming from. How do these fields get their oil and gas? Well, they get it from all these pipelines. These are the other crude oil and gas pipelines that are in the U.S. There's two things I want to point out from this. One is that there's no pipelines connecting the center of the U.S. to the West Coast. So that market is separated from the center of the U.S. because 89% of the crude oil transportation in the U.S. is done through pipeline. So the rest of it's done through railroad and trucking. Also, on the East Coast, there's very few pipelines. So that also creates a market that is separated from where the majority of the oil and gas is being produced. So that will be important in a minute. Now, another story that you've heard a lot about is importing and exporting of oil. And that's something that gets confusing when you look at all the different headlines, like, oh, we're net exporting now. Oh, we're importing all these barrels from Russia. There's a lot of confusion, things that don't quite seem to go together. So we're going to go through that. So this slide shows the net imports of crude oil, just crude oil, into the United States. From 2012, we've had a dramatic decrease in imports. And 2020, where it hits the bottom there of that curve, is where COVID happened and everybody pulled back on production. Another interesting thing I want to point out is there's also exports of crude oil. So both things are happening. And the reason that both is happening is because of that difference in markets. There's essentially 3 or 4 different key market areas. So the West Coast is separated from the center, which is separated from the East Coast. On different sides of the country, it sometimes makes sense to get oil and gas from our neighbors in Canada or Mexico, or from Russia into California, or from Russia into the East Coast. And so we're able to export some of our Gulf Coast oil and gas. And then at the same time, we're importing into other ports. So both things are happening. Now, the numbers that you heard about us being a net exporter is from this next slide. Overall, ever since this shale revolution and hydraulic fracturing technology happened, we've been slowly chipping away at how much overall petroleum products we have to import, to where we crossed that threshold in 2020 of being a net exporter. And that is of all petroleum products. So that is including the propanes and the butanes and the jet fuels and the gasolines and the LNG and the crude oil, all of the things together. We are a net exporter sometimes. So you've also might have heard stories about how, we went from being a net importer to a net exporter, and now we're an importer again. Well, if we look at this chart, it bounces around being a net importer to net exporter, and then if you blur your eyes, we're roughly around 0. Yes, we have been creeping up into importing a little more than we export on an average, but we're much better than we were in, say, 2004. So how much is the U.S. importing from Russia? So we have those dynamics we just talked about. Overall, we're importing about 3% of our oil and gas from Russia. Not anymore because of the ban, but prior to that, it was about 3%. Most of our oil comes from Canada. The second in line comes from Mexico. That makes sense, right? They're north and south of us. Russia is mostly because it's a type of oil that fits very well to our historic supply of oil. So the Russian oil that we get is a lower API, which is the type of oil that we produce. So A low API oil is around 35 and below. So this is a low API oil. It's black. If I were to pour it on my hands, it would cover my hands in black oil. It's like the Beverly Hillbillies show from a long time ago where they shot in the ground and black oil sprouted up from the ground.
And then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude.
That's a low API oil. You think of it as oil because that's historically what we've had a lot of. It's what a lot of our refineries are set up to handle the best. Oil that comes out of Russia is very similar to that type of oil. It's about 31 degrees API, and it is a sour crude. So sour means there's sulfides in it. Now, it doesn't mean we can't process our crude oil. It just means that it's more economic to process what they're already set up to process. So, right? I mean, you already have it set up one way. It makes the most sense to get it from a nearby source that with existing shipping channels, existing contracts, and existing types of oil. The U.S. oil that we're producing from these horizontal unconventional reservoirs is a much higher API. On average, we're about 45 degrees API, and that ends up being something like a cross between that black oil and gasoline. It's not completely see-through. You can tell it has a color, but it's very light. It's semi-transparent. It smells like gasoline. It evaporates into the air much easier than oil does. It won't coat your hand in black like a 30 or less API oil will. It's just a different quality. It's a different mixture of the methane and pentane and ethane molecules than the other heavier oils. So it's a different hydrocarbon mixture, which creates different hydrocarbon products at the refinery. That is why we have so much crude oil, but it's not the type of crude oil that our refineries necessarily want to process, so it's getting shipped other places. Now, I thought this was interesting. Here's all the gas pipelines. So one thing we have an abundance of is natural gas, and that's also something Russia has an abundance of. Natural gas prices in the US versus natural gas prices in Europe, there's a dramatic difference. But the US has an abundance of gas. For years, gas prices, natural gas prices anyway, have been pennies on the dollar versus what they used to be because we have so much gas coming out of these unconventional reservoirs. Gas is easiest to transport through pipeline. Honestly, it's hard to grab hold of gas and put it in a container, right? When was the last time you had a container of gas? Probably as a prank if you did. This gas, in order to transport it any other way than pipeline, you have to supercool it and condense it into a liquid, which is what liquefied natural gas is, LNG. We have so much gas right now that that's actually getting transported away from the US in giant LNG barges over into Europe. So the next thing we're going to look at is the federal lands. So you probably heard of all the effects and delays that we're having because we can't drill on federal land anymore. That's not true. There's a lot of land in the US that is federal, and right now it's difficult to get a permit on it. Permit is what allows you to drill on that land. But if a permit is existing, we can drill. All of this in blue is federal lands in the United States, and then I have the basins laid on top of this. So now we can see where those federal lands are lying on top of those basins that we have. So now here in red are all the wells that have been drilled in the last 3 years overlaid on top of the blue federal lands. There are several areas in the Rocky Mountains around Utah and Colorado and Wyoming that it is very difficult to drill, not only for the federal lands side of it, but also because of the wildlife preservation that needs to happen in that area. But the other big area of activity that's butting up to this federal land is in New Mexico. So let's zoom in on that a little more. It's almost hard to see all the blue federal lands because there's so many wells that's overlaid on top. This is one of the highest value positions in the US right now. And almost every bit of the New Mexico side of the Delaware Basin, which is a basin in the Permian, is federal. And this is where we're having the most impacts right now because there's so much federal land on some of the highest value acreage in the country. Prior to the executive order, a whole bunch of permits were filed on federal lands, and those permits are only good for so long. A lot of the drilling is happening on the New Mexico side of the Delaware Basin, not only because it's great wells to drill, but operators are trying to get through these permits before they expire. Those two things are causing a lot of drilling to happen in New Mexico, on top of the drilling that was already going to be happening in New Mexico. So this is where the biggest issue between federal and desire to drill is happening. So what do these wells look like when you put one of these wells online? One of the headlines you might have seen is that oil and gas falls off really quickly from these new wells. So you have to keep bringing on new wells over and over and over again in order to get that sustained production. So this is 500 months of production forecasted out. That's the x-axis is in months. But I want you to look at the y-axis, which is the one going up. So it's a log plot. Green is oil, orange is gas. You see how it dramatically goes from a high number to a low number really quickly in the very beginning? Well, a log plot means it's even worse than it looks. It's going from 10,000 down to 1,000 really quickly. That's barrels per month. You have a well that produces 1,000 barrels a day when it first comes online, and 6 months later, it might be down to 100 barrels a day. 2 years later, it's down to 10 barrels a day. 5 years after first production, it might be only at 3 or 4 barrels a day. And then it will just ride out that 3 or 4 barrels for the next 20, 30 years. Now, one thing you might have noticed from that timeline is we only started drilling these wells 10, 12 years ago. And we're forecasting out 20, 30, 40, 60 years into the future of what these wells are going to do. And we've gotten it wrong in the past. We've gotten it really wrong in the past because a lot of these equations are things we haven't had to do before. We haven't had wells that look like this. We haven't had to test these theories like we have now. And when we're wrong, even just a little bit, you're wrong across hundreds of thousands of wells. And so it compounds really quickly. So when you see headlines of companies having to write down reserves, that means that they said they had too much inventory and they're having to remove that inventory, and that's reducing the value of their company. You overpredict, you overestimate, and get it wrong. These companies are valued based on how much is left in the tank being the reservoir. And then just to show you, again, the complexity of what's being produced, here's an actual map of a piece of New Mexico that's being developed. And each number on this map, these gray numbers, is 1 mile section. So a 1 mile section is 640 acres large. And so it's 1 mile by 1 mile. And the wells that are being drilled are 1 to 3 miles long. And so a lot of these in this particular area are 1.5 miles long. There's so many wells that you almost can't see where one well starts and another well ends. There's so many reservoirs being targeted that from an aerial shot, you can't see all the wells that are being drilled because they're directly on top of each other. With this type of spacing, you have some areas where in a 1 square mile area, you have 30 wells. Each well costs $7 million, $9 million, depending on the operator. That's a lot of money that's being concentrated in a very small amount of acreage. And so that's where you get these big dollars thrown around to say you own 1 acre in one of these type of areas. You might have $90,000 of value just in that 1 acre. That's not that big of an area, especially when you have mineral owners that own entire ranches where they own 640 acres or more. And suddenly they're getting thrown these big numbers of how much someone wants to buy their minerals for. And that is the confusion that's happening right now. If you get thrown a check, say, hey, I'll offer you $10 million for your minerals. That sounds amazing. But what if it's actually worth $30 million? That's where the disconnect happens. And that's where the education needs to come from. And that's why I'm doing this, because that's what makes my blood boil, is when I have those scenarios come my way. So that's what we're working on. Continuing on, so when we combine all of those factors that we just talked about, the U.S. is having an issue right now with investor confidence. The investors have been told the last several years that oil and gas is going away. We want to invest in renewables, 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 renewables. Don't go near oil and gas. We're going to drop your stock price if you do. There's a demand for oil and gas because of a supply issue, but investors aren't quite ready to go head first like they were before. Here's active rig count, which a rig is the thing that drills a well, active rig count in red versus oil price in black. Traditionally, you've seen that price increase and you see rig count increase with it, because it would make sense that the more you're getting for each barrel, the more barrels you're going to want to drill. But recently, you've seen that price increase without a similar increase in number of rigs because that investor confidence just isn't there. There's also some other things. There's efficiency of each rig. One rig used to take 60 days to drill a well, and now it takes 20. Historically, $80 oil would be plenty to get those rigs fully mobilized again. But it's been so volatile that the industry just isn't quite there in projecting that this is what it's going to be for the foreseeable future. And that hesitancy to invest is causing there to be a supply concern. Whenever there's a supply concern, that causes pricing to go up. Regardless of whether or not it's actually hard to find, the pricing will start going up preemptively. And this is not the oil company setting it, this is the market setting it. So the same people trading on Wall Street are buying and selling oil. It's the same reason the oil crashed in April of 2020, went down below zero. It's those same dynamics causing it to go up now. It's not the oil company setting it. If it was, the oil companies would never have made it go below zero in 2020. It's the same dynamics that caused it to go down before are making it go up again now. It's just so y'all know on timing, if you employ a rig and start drilling today, you'd probably have at least 6 months before that well will come online at the earliest, because you'd probably be drilling a couple wells together, and then you'd have to wait to get the frack crews out there. It takes a week or two to frack a well. I have a video on that. The fastest I would expect it would be 2 months, the slowest up to a year. This next slide shows drilled but uncompleted wells. Right now in January of 22, there's over 4,000 drilled but uncompleted wells. So some of that are wells that are in process, waiting to be completed, like they were just recently drilled and they're going to be completed. Some of those are wells that were decided to not be completed. Maybe these were drilled and then investor money was pulled out because of market influences. Maybe the company went bankrupt. Maybe there's a new owner and they want to drill Permian instead of Eagle Ford. There's a lot of things that go into why there's a well drilled but not completed. Ideally, you drill a well, you complete it. That's how you get your money back after drilling it. But there's a lot of wells that are drilled and are waiting to be completed. Those can come on much faster than wells that aren't even drilled yet or even permitted yet. So that's all I have today. I know that was probably enough, probably way too much as it was. Feel free to leave comments below. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. Remember to hit like if you like this type of content and want to hear more of it. Bye.